The stories presented in this video are real, but we have changed the characters' names and altered images to protect their identities. The creator of this video is not an investigative officer. These narratives have been sourced from various internet platforms. Our intent is not to accuse or target anyone in particular. Thank you for understanding.
Welcome to True Crime Stories Hub. Today we're going to show you Shaker Heights, a peaceful Ohio suburb of the upper middle class, today. However, a dark scheme that would result in murder was simmering beneath the surface of this picturesque hamlet. This is the tale of a husband who, in order to marry his wife's daughter, poisoned her due to a deranged infatuation. Carol McMillan, a 48-year-old Shaker Heights, Ohio resident, had a loving family and lofty aspirations. She was well known in the neighborhood for her pleasant smile and amiable demeanor. Carol was the type of person who was always willing to lend a hand when needed and would stop to talk with neighbors. She was involved in the community, frequently planning neighborhood cookouts and attending church functions. Everyone who knew Carol liked her since she was a pleasant person. Carol resided in Shaker Heights, a Cleveland neighborhood renowned for its exquisite architecture and vibrant feeling of community, in a lovely two-story house on a tree-lined lane. With its well-known liberal politics, mix of new and old homes, neighborhood coffee shops, and thriving art scene, Shaker Heights is frequently characterized as having a boho chic air. Family portraits, comfortable furnishings, and a kitchen that always smelled of freshly made cookies were all commonplace in Carol's house. Carol enjoyed cooking and was well known for her chocolate chip cookies, which she frequently shared with neighbors or brought to work. Daniel McMillan, Carol's spouse, was 16 years her junior. Daniel and Carol seemed to be a happy pair, despite their age difference. Despite Daniel's hectic schedule as a health insurance company employee, the couple found time for one another. After 5 years of marriage, they shared a home with Carol's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Sarah Levinsky McMillan. A brilliant and driven college student, Sarah aspired to become a doctor. Carol gave her daughter all the support she could since she was proud of her. Carol was organizing a trip to Orlando with her family in the weeks before she passed away. She talked about the vacation all the time since she was so thrilled about it. She was packing a new pair of sandals, sunscreen, and summer clothing into a new luggage she had just bought. Carol was eager for the vacation and liked spending time with her family, but her joy would be permanently dashed when she was discovered dead in her house early on April 17, 2019. Shaker Heights was just beginning to awaken that morning. It was one of those chilly, cloudy spring days in Ohio. Only a handful of early risers were out strolling their dogs or getting their morning coffee from Starbucks, and the area was peaceful. Even though Carol McMillan was normally early, something wasn't right that day. Carol's 19-year-old daughter, Sarah Levinsky McMillan, walked down to the kitchen at about 8:30 a.m. and discovered her mother unconscious on the floor. There was a can of Carol's favorite beverage, which is also a national favorite, next to her. The floor was covered in Diet Pepsi. Slowly, the sweet liquid soaked into the grout in between the tiles. Sarah shouted in panic and dialed 911 right away, her hands shaking. Sarah was too overwhelmed to be calmed by the operator's voice. She was sobbing and pleading for help to arrive right away. Within minutes of their arrival, the paramedics saw Sarah pacing the living room in disbelief. With the exception of the 911 call still reverberating from Sarah's phone on the kitchen counter, the home was unnaturally quiet. It was too late when the paramedics arrived at Carol's side. At the scene, Carol was pronounced deceased. Sarah was shocked by what was taking place. Her mother had been choosing out clothes and made plans for their planned vacation just the day before. Now that she was gone, Sarah felt disoriented and perplexed. Sarah called her stepfather, Daniel McMillan, who was working at the time, while the paramedics were on duty. Daniel had a frantic reaction. As Sarah sobbed into the phone, he started to shout and scream. He sounded nearly crazed with sadness, but he assured her he would leave work immediately. The Shaker Heights Police Department arrived at the McMillan residence in a timely manner. The inquiry was headed by Detective Laura Robitek, who had worked with the police for more than 15 years. Robitek was renowned for her systematic technique and keen eye. She was known for cracking even the most difficult situations. She knew something was wrong as soon as she got to the scene on the morning of April 17, 2019. With a well-kept lawn and a garden that was starting to bloom with the earliest indications of spring, the McMillan residence was an ordinary suburban home. The house was tidy and well-maintained inside. The dead body of Carol McMillan on the kitchen floor was the only clue that something was unusual. A can of Diet Pepsi, the sentimental favorite beverage in America, was poured all around her. Securing the murder scene was the first task Detective Robitek and her crew had to complete. To keep neighbors and bystanders away, they promptly placed officers at the entry and put up yellow tape around the house's perimeter. The kitchen was closely inspected by the investigators. Nothing seemed out of place, and there were no indications of forced entry. The rear door was secured from the inside, and Carol's handbag was on the counter, undamaged. The group observed that the can of Diet Pepsi was still comparatively full. Just a tiny bit was spilled on the ground. Robitek took notice of this and gave the crime scene team instructions to gather the can and any leftover liquid as evidence. In order to check for any odd materials, the crew also collected samples from the kitchen floor and counter. They captured every detail by taking pictures of the situation from every possible viewpoint. To ascertain the precise cause of Carol's death, an autopsy was scheduled. Robitek wasn't really certain, but the paramedics on the spot had suspected a heart attack. Detective Robitek was skeptical of Carol's posture and the fact that she had just moments earlier been consuming her favorite soda, or pop as it is known in the Midwest. The detectives searched the house for additional clues as the inquiry went on. Carol's personal items were searched in an attempt to find evidence of foul play. In order to examine her recent calls and messages, her phone was also confiscated as proof. Detective Robitek was aware that this case would need close scrutiny. Carol's death was considerably more complicated than first appeared. As they investigated Carol McMillan's killing, the police focused on her family members. Her husband, Daniel McMillan, was the first individual they questioned. Carol was substantially older than 32-year-old Daniel McMillan. He was well known for being successful, attractive, and personable while working for a Cleveland health insurance company. With a steady job, a lovely home, and a fantastic family, he appeared to have it all. However, the investigators discovered another aspect of Daniel as they continued their investigation. When Daniel was a junior analyst at the insurance business 6 years prior, he had met Carol. Carol, who was then a widow, had been enchanted by his youthful vigor and self-assurance. A year later, they were married, and Daniel became Sarah's stepfather at the age of 13. Although their marriage appeared to be strong on the surface, acquaintances saw that Daniel and Carol had grown more aloof during the previous 12 months. He put in more hours at work, frequently arriving home late or saying he had to travel for work. Daniel seemed composed, even icy, in his initial police interview. He appeared to be in shock by Carol's passing, but his feelings were subdued. He explained to Detective Laura Robitek that he was at work when it occurred and that he had hurried home when Sarah called. Daniel acknowledged that he and Carol had become estranged over time, but he said they had a nice marriage when questioned about their connection. He maintained that he was not responsible for her passing and did not understand why anyone would wish to hurt her. However, Detective Robitek's suspicions increased as the interrogation went on. Daniel was too cool and collected. Daniel was evasive when questioned about Carol's plans, claiming that he was a feminist and disliked monitoring his wife's daily activities. He also couldn't remember the last time they had sex as a couple or had a meaningful conversation. It was strange to Robitek that Daniel, who professed to love his wife, appeared so cut off from her life. Daniel's statements were found to be inconsistent by the detectives as well. He said, for instance, that he was aware that Diet Pepsi was Carol's favorite beverage, but he was unable to explain why, when she was discovered, a half-empty can was discovered close to her body. He stated that Carol frequently drank soda, but he didn't appear to be very familiar with her other routines or habits. The cops started thinking about Daniel's possible motivation as they questioned him further. Is it possible that Daniel desired to leave the marriage? Or was he motivated by something else, something more sinister? Daniel had been harboring secrets, according to the results of the investigation into his life. His sexual infatuation with his stepdaughter, Sarah, was among the most startling. The police now had a new line of inquiry thanks to this disclosure. Daniel's desire for Carol to move aside could be explained if he was in love with Sarah. However, much more proof would be needed to establish Daniel's involvement in Carol's killing. As the puzzle began to take shape, Detective Robitek understood they needed to be meticulous in their work. Sarah Levinsky McMillan, Carol's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, was the next person the police looked into. A brilliant, driven young woman, Sarah was well on her way to become a doctor. She had received a scholarship for her academic achievement at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where she was a pre-med student. Sarah was well known for her generosity and commitment to her studies. She frequently tutored poor pupils and volunteered at nearby hospitals. Carol was a strong, kind role model, and Sarah had always looked up to her mother. The two had a tight relationship and would frequently spend their weekends shopping, watching movies, or simply lounging in bed and discussing life. Particularly after Sarah's biological father passed away when she was still a young girl, Carol had been her greatest pillar of support. Because of the extremely deep link that had been formed between mother and daughter as a result of that loss, Sarah was even more devastated by Carol's unexpected death. Sarah was clearly upset when the police first came up to her. Naturally, the shock of discovering her mother dead added to the agony of losing her. When Sarah decided to stop and have a bite, she explained to the investigators that she had been preparing for an impending biology test. When she arrived in the kitchen, she discovered her mother unconscious on the floor, next to a can of Diet Pepsi. Sarah frantically dialed 911 in the hopes that it wouldn't be too late. Sarah was cooperative yet very upset during the interview. She said that her mother had been in a cheerful and contented state lately, showing no symptoms of tension or discontent. Sarah described Carol as someone who was adored by everyone who knew her, and she was unable to think of anyone who would wish to hurt her. When the police questioned Sarah about her connection with her stepfather, Daniel, Sarah praised him, calling him a darling and a father figure who supported her. The fact that she was totally ignorant of his covert sexual obsession with her further alarmed and raised suspicions among the cops. Nothing pointed to Sarah's involvement in her mother's death when the investigators dug deeper into her life. Her alibi was confirmed. When the murder occurred, Sarah was in her room, deep in concentration on her studies. With posts about friends, school, liberal political issues, and impending tests, her social media activity demonstrated the normal life of a college student. There were no indications of problematic behavior or covert partnerships. The dynamics within the McMillan household, however, continued to raise suspicions among the authorities. They pondered whether Sarah might have unintentionally been a pawn in Daniel's scheme. Sarah might potentially be in danger if Daniel's sexual fixation with her was as severe as they thought. However, as of just now, There was no proof that connected Sarah to the crime, so the detectives could concentrate on other things. Carol's closest friend and confidant, Jessica Miller, was the third individual the police questioned. Real estate salesperson Jessica, 45, had known Carol for more than 10 years. Over the years, the two women became inseparable after bonding over their common experiences as Shaker Heights working women. Jessica was frequently spotted at Carol's house, helping out at neighborhood gatherings or just hanging out over a glass of wine in the evenings. Their friendship, which was based on mutual respect and trust, seemed indestructible to all who knew them. But the cops quickly learned that Jessica had been concealing a big secret. Jessica had been having an affair with Daniel McMillan, even though she seemed to be loyal to Carol. Everyone who knew the three was taken aback by this news, particularly considering how close Jessica and Carol were. Jessica claims that the romance began approximately a year before to Carol's passing. According to her, everything started innocently enough when Daniel showed up by himself at one of Jessica's well-known hot tub parties. Things swiftly progressed into a full-fledged sexual relationship, following some provocative banter. Jessica acknowledged that she felt a little bad about betraying her buddy, but she also added that she couldn't help but be attracted to Daniel. Jessica was apprehensive and defensive during her police interview. She maintained that she had nothing to do with Carol's death, even though she was aware that her involvement with Daniel put her under suspicion. According to Jessica, she was a little saddened by Carol's death, and had even thought about having less sex sessions with Daniel as a result of her guilt. She did, however, also disclose that she was crushed when Daniel recently told her he was in love with someone else. Although Jessica was unsure of the identity of the other woman, she had a sneaking suspicion that it was a younger woman, perhaps Sarah. Jessica was questioned by the investigators on her whereabouts on the day of Carol's death and her sexual relationship with Daniel. Jessica claimed to have clients who could confirm her alibi and to have participated in a Cleveland Heights real estate showing. After investigating, the police were able to verify that Jessica was in fact with customers when the murder occurred. However, considering Jessica's mental struggle and jealousy over Daniel's changing emotions, they couldn't rule out the chance that she was somehow involved. Jessica continued to be a figure of interest in the inquiry despite her alibi. She was a problematic figure in the case because of her close friendship with Carol and her affair with Daniel. The detectives had to wonder if Jessica's sadness and envy could have made her act out of character. However, Jessica found herself in a difficult situation, torn between her grief over her friend's passing and her guilt about the affair, in the absence of hard proof connecting her to the crime. Shaker Heights experienced cold, overcast weather on April 27, 2019, just after 9 a.m., which is typical of an Ohio spring. An important development in the case came to the detectives as they kept looking for hints. According to a toxicology study from the laboratory, cyanide poisoning was the cause of Carol McMillan's death. Her death was confirmed to be a planned act of murder rather than a natural incident because the deadly poison had been mixed into her Diet Pepsi can. The investigation team was astonished to learn that cyanide was used as the murder weapon. An uncommon and lethal toxin, cyanide is frequently linked to well-known espionage incidents. The detectives were aware that the crime they were investigating was premeditated. Carol's murder had been meticulously planned and carried out by someone. The investigation's focus was changed by this fresh information, which also gave the police a clearer path to follow. The detectives went back to the crime scene right away to search for any signs of the poison or information about how it might have gotten into Carol's drink. The Diet Pepsi can, the kitchen area around it, and any containers or anything that might have come into touch with the poison were all inspected. Everything from the fingerprints on the can to the remains of the drink was examined by forensic specialists. The forensic team discovered traces of the poison on the can's rim, indicating that it had been purposefully tampered with, even though they were unable to uncover any direct indications of cyanide in the kitchen. However, this finding prompted additional inquiries. Who was in possession of the poison? And how, without Carol seeing, did they add anything to her drink? In order to find any history of chemical knowledge or access to hazardous materials, the police started investigating the backgrounds of each suspect. Additionally, they looked at recent purchases and internet searches that would point to someone looking into or obtaining cyanide. The detectives were aware that it was difficult to procure cyanide. Its user had probably planned ahead quite carefully. The suspects were also under pressure from this new evidence. They were questioned again by the police, who concentrated on their familiarity with poisons and any questionable actions that may have preceded Carol's demise. Finding the person with the resources and motivation to carry out such a planned crime was the investigators' first priority. The inquiry gained a new sense of urgency as they honed in on the facts, because the case now clearly pointed to murder. Just before noon on April 20th, 2019, the police achieved a breakthrough in their investigation that would eventually lead them to the murderer. The police started assembling a troubling picture after closely analyzing the evidence and spoke with the suspects again. Everything suggested that Carol's husband, Daniel McMillan, was the cause of her demise. 32-year-old Daniel McMillan was a successful and affable man who worked for a health insurance firm. He appeared to have it all: a steady career, a lovely wife, and the ideal life in Shaker Heights, a progressive utopia. On the inside, though, Daniel was a guy motivated by sinister and perverse sexual urges. Carol's daughter from her previous marriage, Sarah Levinsky McMillan, had become the object of his sexual passion. Although Sarah was only 19 years old and oblivious to his intentions, Daniel had secretly harbored sexual desires for her. Daniel grew more and more estranged from Carol as his obsession deepened, viewing her as a hindrance to his unsettling dream of beginning a new life with Sarah as his wife. Important evidence that connected Daniel to the crime was found by the detectives. He had been investigating cyanide for several months prior to Carol's death, according to an examination of his internet search history. He had looked up information about its effects on the human body, how to use it, and where to purchase it. This incriminating evidence implied that Daniel had meticulously planned the murder, with the goal of using cyanide to kill Carol covertly. Daniel exploited Carol's everyday routine on the day of the murder. He was aware that she drank Diet Pepsi every day after work since she loved it. The inquiry revealed that Daniel had added cyanide to Carol's Diet Pepsi can since he knew she would consume it as soon as she got home. Carol collapsed and died in a matter of minutes due to the poison's rapid action. Daniel intended for it to appear as though he had had an unexpected heart attack, but the toxicology results showed otherwise. Daniel was confronted by the police with the evidence they had collected. He initially made an effort to claim innocence. However, Daniel's facade started to fall apart as the investigators revealed the facts: his internet searches, his developing fixation with Sarah, and the cyanide traces on the can. The Shaker Heights community was taken aback by Daniel's imprisonment. When Carol's friends and neighbors learned that the guy they had once regarded as a faithful husband had done such a horrible thing, they were appalled. The news upset Sarah, who found it hard to believe that the man she had looked up to as a father figure had been covertly planning to harm her mother. On January 15, 2019, Daniel McMillan's trial got underway at the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. The case garnered a lot of media attention, and the hearings were widely covered by local news outlets. The Shaker Heights neighborhood was devastated by Carol McMillan's murder, and many people wanted justice to be done. Assistant District Attorney James Leakey, 45, the prosecutor, was renowned for his methodical and tenacious approach to criminal prosecutions. Leakey made a compelling argument against Daniel McMillan. Citing the cyanide evidence in Carol's Diet Pepsi and Daniel's in-depth research on the poison online, he contended that Daniel had premeditatedly planned Carol's murder. Leakey characterized Daniel's behavior as calculating and cold, highlighting how his fixation with Sarah Levinsky McMillan was the driving force behind the crime. However, Laura Phillips, Daniel's 38-year-old defense lawyer, attempted to present an alternative image. Phillips contended that Daniel's judgment may have been impacted by his personal issues and stress. She asserted that mental instability, rather than premeditation, was the cause of Daniel's conduct. Although the evidence against Daniel was overwhelming, Phillips tried to counter that there was insufficient direct evidence connecting him to the poisoning. Sarah and other members of Carol's family were present at the trial every day and were clearly upset. Because she had to face the truth of her mother's passing and her stepfather's treachery, Sarah was most impacted by the trial. Carol's friends and co-workers gave moving testimony in court, describing her as a kind and compassionate individual who could never have predicted such a tragic end. On January 22, 2019, following days of testimony and evidence presentation, the jury considered and rendered a decision. The conviction of Daniel McMillan for first-degree murder was upheld. Daniel was given a life sentence without the chance of release by the judge. Carol's relatives and friends were both relieved and saddened by the punishment. They believed that even though justice had been done, Daniel's betrayal and the loss of Carol would still hurt. The decision gave the case a sense of closure, but it had a long-lasting effect on everyone concerned. In order to rebuild their lives and recall the warmth and generosity Carol had brought into their lives, Carol's friends and family had to deal with the fallout from the trial. The trial was a sobering reminder of the evil that may exist behind even the most flawless exteriors. Although things in Shaker Heights started to settle down after the trial and Daniel McMillan's conviction, the episode had a profound effect on everyone involved. The community had to deal with the consequences of the crime, and the McMillan family was irrevocably altered. After being moved, Daniel McMillan started serving his life term at the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Due to the extensive media coverage of his trial, he gained notoriety within the prison system. The luxurious lifestyle he had previously led was in sharp contrast to his imprisonment. For a while, his situation was covered by the media, with numerous local publications covering his relationships with other prisoners and his transition to prison life. Carol's daughter, Sarah Levinsky McMillan, had a challenging path ahead. She had been profoundly impacted by the murder and was a pre-med student when her mother passed away. Sarah took a vacation from school following the trial in order to attend to her mental health and deal with the trauma she had experienced over the previous few months. Professional counselors, friends, and family all provided her with assistance. Her community came together in support of her, and many people were impressed by her fortitude in the face of such adversity. Daniel's covert lover and Carol's old friend Jessica Miller also had to deal with the fallout from the case. Despite being cleared of any involvement in the murder, she became controversial due to the affair and her position in Daniel's life. Because of the bad press, Jessica's real estate company faltered. In an attempt to move on from the past and rebuild her personal and professional lives, she made the decision to start over in a different city. Carol's family and friends gradually sought to restore normalcy. They concentrated on keeping up the community service she had been enthusiastic about and on honoring her in a positive way. The case left everyone involved with long-lasting scars and served as a sobering reminder of how easily violence and betrayal can upend a life. The shock of Carol McMillan's murder subsided with time, but the wounds it caused remained irreversible. Known for its quiet ambiance and close-knit community, Shaker Heights was permanently changed by the terrible events that had taken place there. Carol's family and friends gradually resumed their regular lives, but it was hard to fill the vacuum she left behind. By continuing to support the causes and activities she had liked, those who knew her continued to pay tribute to her memory. Because of Carol's extensive involvement in charitable endeavors in the community, the Carol McMillan Foundation was created in her honor, with the goal of assisting local impoverished families and children. The foundation swiftly came to represent Carol's lasting legacy and a means for her spirit to keep inspiring and impacting people in her immediate vicinity. The process of moving ahead was painful and slow for Sarah Levinsky McMillan. She was mentally damaged by the shock of losing her mother so unexpectedly and discovering her stepfather's evil plans. Eventually, Sarah returned to Case Western Reserve University to pursue her mother's dream of becoming a doctor, despite having taken a gap from her pre-med studies. Despite the difficulties along the way, Sarah managed to persist with the help of her friends, family, and community. She frequently spoke her experiences at community gatherings, promoting mental health awareness and the need of getting support when needed. Once a well-liked Shaker Heights resident, Daniel McMillan fell into obscurity while serving his life sentence. His formerly brilliant future and promising career have been diminished to a string of depressing days spent in prison. Eventually, his story, which had captured the public's interest throughout the trial, became simply another heartbreaking account of a life gone wrong. Daniel's days in prison were repetitive and replete with sorrow. In addition to ruining his life, his acts had irrevocably harmed the people he professed to love. It was both a boon and a bane for Jessica Miller to decide to leave Shaker Heights and start again. She had to accept her part in the sad events, even if she was able to avoid the judgment and rumors that had surrounding her following the affair and trial. Jessica had the chance to start over after moving to a new place, but she frequently battled feelings of humiliation and remorse. She immersed herself into her work in the hopes that she could somehow make up for her previous transgressions by achieving professional success. The relationship between Jessica and Sarah remained solid in spite of time and distance. The two women remained in contact and helped one another through the challenging times in their lives. In an effort to provide Sarah some level of security and comfort, Jessica in particular was resolved to support her in any way she could. Although Shaker Heights gradually settled back into its regular rhythm in the ensuing years, the memory of Carol McMillan's murder persisted. It acted as a warning that the darker sides of human nature can still exist in even the most idyllic societies. The case was utilized as a warning story and became part of local history, frequently mentioned in whispers. Life would never be the same for Sarah, Jessica, and the other members of Carol's family. They would always be affected by the loss of Carol, but they would also never forget the lessons they had learned about forgiving one another, being resilient, and the value of standing by one another through unfathomable hardship. Despite being tragically brief, Carol McMillan's life had a profound effect on those who knew her. Long after she passed away, people were still motivated by her generosity, kindness, and love for her town. Every year, the Carol McMillan Foundation expanded, supporting more families and preserving her memory in a way that was significant and consistent with the principles she had always upheld.